Hello, and welcome to the first episode of this new program, China Talking Points, from the Sinica Network. I am Kaiser Kuo, host of the Sinica Podcast, and I'm delighted to introduce the two co-hosts of this program, Eric Olander of the China Global South Project, who hosts the excellent China in Africa and China Global South podcast. He comes to us from Southeast Asia. Hello, Eric.
A very good morning to you and a good evening from Southeast Asia.
Yeah, good evening to you. Also joining us is Andrew Polk, co-founder of the strategic advisory firm Trivium China, with offices all over the place, host of their outstanding podcast. Hello, Andrew. How are you? You're joining us.
Hey, Kaiser. Hey, Eric. Good to see you guys. Glad to be here.
Great to see you.
And rounding out, as she will as often as she's able, is Lizzi Lee, who is fellow with the Asian Society Policy Institute, my old comrade in arms from the late, great China Project. Hello, Lizzi. How are you?
Great to be here.
So what is this show? What is China Talking Points? Well, it is a live, or it's going to be live, unscripted, very unscripted video podcast that will stream every other week on, what did we say, Wednesday mornings, East Coast time, Wednesday evenings in Asia. And we're going to be talking about, well, what's happening in China. You can find the show on the YouTube channels of both the China Global South Project and on the new Sinica Network YouTube channel, which has yet to officially launch. You can find it also on the Sinica Substack each week, along with Sinica, the China Global South podcast, and of course the Trivium Podcast and their weekly roundup. Lots of stuff there. We hope that you'll be tuning in regularly. So let's jump in. The big news, of course, is that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Jamieson Greer, who is the USTR, met with China's top trade negotiator, He Lifeng, in Geneva over the weekend at the residence of the Swiss UN ambassador to negotiate what amounts to a truce in the trade war that's been raging really since Trump's Liberation Day tariffs were announced on April 9th. So let's start with Lizzi. I mean, you're the economist among us, but what did you make of the joint fanfare, or the joint statement and all of that fanfare around that?
Well, I think, the market can take a moment to breathe, finally. In general, I think this is terrific news, and I will admit that it beat my expectation. As I, sort of go through my old Twitter post or X post, I did write something on April 9th, I think a deal might be coming sooner than people expected, but I will admit, reducing tariffs by 100 percentage point, that was beyond what I expected. So, yeah.
Yeah. And Andrew, what about you? What's your take on it? Just at 30,000 feet.
Yeah, I mean, definitely a positive development, as Lizzi said. Also, far beyond my expectations. I actually was in the camp that was like, this thing is going to drag on forever. And just to be clear, this thing ain't done. So, we're having a temporary reprieve. But, who knows what the next 90 days holds and beyond. Something I want to get into in a minute, though, is maybe the most important thing, at least for our clients, is not the reduction in tariffs, but the still unclear reduction in non-tariff trade barriers that China offered as well, which is likely to include, more shipments of rare earth elements to U.S. companies. So we can get into that in a minute.
Yeah, especially
that seemed like a pretty big concession.
Yeah, especially with the repeal of AI diffusion rule and this global ban on Huawei chips. It's not clear to me what's going to happen because Andrew, as a lot of the export ban were actually tied to semiconductor export control, not the tariffs per se. So it's not clear what's going to happen in that space, and we're also watching very closely on that front.
Totally. And I heard Eric say as well, Lizzi, that, it seems like a big concession, but our argument was all along that they're putting these things on so they have something to roll back if a deal happens. And so I think it was, a concession that was sort of meant to be, or that was designed into the process by the Chinese as we kind of see it.
Right. I don't think that's in doubt.
I mean, I'm curious to get your guys' reaction because my first gut feeling of all this when it came down was, what's the point of all this now? So, I mean, the whole point of the high tariffs, I know, but this is what I don't understand is that the whole point was to put the embargo on in order to force companies to reshore manufacturing into the U.S. Intellectually, that made sense on one level, that it was prohibitive now to manufacture in China to export to the U.S. 30%, 40%, wherever that number lies, no longer makes that prohibitive. It just makes it more expensive. Some of the costs will be absorbed by the supplier side, some will be absorbed by the importer, and some will be absorbed by the consumer. That will be spread out. And so what does Trump get out of this other than higher prices, which he's going to get killed at the polls because it's going to have an inflationary effect? I don't understand what the point.
Where you'll find that. I mean, you're looking for
I guess not. I mean, it just didn't make any sense to me. I mean, what he was trying to achieve, because if you listen to Steve Bannon, he makes a very kind of cogent argument that says this is all part of centering American manufacturing. But this deal with China will not center American manufacturing.
Yeah, because Steve Bannon's always the best at saying washing Trump effectively.
He's not he's actually one of the more articulate guys on the MAGA side of things. Yeah. And he does put out a vision which at least is coherent. Yeah. And so I guess I'm really confused about what this whole point is, you know.
And Eric, I think you're 100% right. I mean, the problem I have with tariffs is that if they're not high enough, say, 30%, 40%, they will basically just be passed on to, consumers, manufacturers, as you said. So if you want to use tariffs as a tool to reshore supply chain manufacturing, they have to be high enough to offset China's cost advantage. And they have to be sustained long enough to give companies actually pain, real motivation to move production back to the US. Again, I don't know the exact level of tariffs that could achieve this, but given China's cost advantage, which is on the scale of 30% to 50%, anything under 50% just won't cut it. But again, I think the thing is, if you have a 60%, 80%, or even 100% tariff, with that sustained elevated level of tariff, that would be a major drag on the U.S. economy. So how do you actually reindustrialize? So tariff is in some sense the wrong tool for potentially the right problem, I think. Correct. But again, yes. Is that the right goal? I'm not 100% sure, but tariff is definitely not the right tool. That's what I think.
And I'll say, I mean, the rationale for the tariffs, or the various rationales for the tariffs, have always been at odds with each other. Is it to raise massive revenue so that we can get rid of the income tax, or is it to reshore, or is it to build leverage? Well, if you're gonna, the more you reshore, the less revenue you get from tariffs, right? Because you're not buying those goods from abroad. So the rationale has always been shifting, just in tariffs in general. My view is that the kind of encircle China piece of this was also a post hoc rationalization. It was all just, we decided to drop the Liberation Day tariffs, except we can't drop China because they've retaliated. Now this is all about China.
That was the plan all along.
Yes, right? Yeah.
That's the 4D chess, right?
Yeah,
right,
exactly. Right. So I mean, I'm very much with Lizzie in that a lot of these goals are arguably, or at least debatably, some positive goals to pursue for the U.S. This isn't necessarily the wrong way about it or the right way about it. Sorry. I am not a supporter of tariffs generally. I hated it when the Biden administration put them on. I just was like, we have more appropriate tools. But generally speaking, Eric, I don't think there's a answer to your question.
I don't feel alone then. I think this is going to be a very boring show if we all agree with each other too much like this.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully I can add a little spice in. Well, I certainly think we all are probably in alignment also on the idea that reshoring of precision manufacturing is something that needs to happen in America, that we can't just go on, not making things in this country that it's just financial services and social media are not in the economy. And I've made the argument a lot about how important that is in an innovation ecosystem. Right. I was never in doubt that both sides were going to experience pain from this. The debate was always, who can endure more pain. Nobody was enduring pain just, for the hell of it, for the sake of it. And neither was going to prefer. I mean, both were obviously going to prefer a climb down that didn't involve an obvious loss of face. But I think in a lot of ways, this is sort of the outcome that one would have hoped for, irrespective of which side you're on, despite the misgivings that you guys have about this. But both sides are able to declare victory, right? And both sides are very loudly proclaiming victory. Neither side feels like it's been handed a gigantic defeat. My big question, though, to you guys is, will we look back on this moment as a defining moment, as a turning point in history? Is this the moment when a defiant China actually stood up, forced the United States to back down, and is now truly a peer competitor? Told you I'd spice things up.
Yeah.
I think this is a defining moment. I think when you're in the middle of the moment, it's hard to tell what that is. Something big is happening here, but we don't know yet the magnitude and the depth of it. But I do feel that there's been a change in the force in the U.S.-China relationship that is probably not going to go back. And remember, when Trump 1 was in power, we thought there would have been a slight reset when Biden came in. Biden did virtually nothing to reset the relationships. He didn't take down the tariffs. He stepped up the pressure in the South China Sea with alliances. So whoever replaces Trump in 28 is probably going to continue what we have now. This is the new normal of where we are. And I suspect that the relationship is going to get only more contentious. Also, just one other point to put out on the table for us to talk about. Remember in the first Trump, remember when the big juicy chocolate cake, the whole Mar-a-Lago thing, and
Sure.
He had this great kind of relationship and everything was great. And then invariably it leads to disappointment, heartbreak, and anger and animosity. I think we're at that point of the chocolate cake right now, where he's kind of, he's still talking very excited about Xi as his friend. He's going to talk to him, and give it 6 to 12 months. And I suspect that their agendas are just so divergent that they can't find a common ground that's going to make them happy ultimately. And so I worry that we're going to next year at this time be in a much more difficult place.
It's just the U.S.-China relationship on a compressed timeline. This is always the case with the U.S. We get our hopes up. We set these unrealistically high expectations, and being unrealistically high, they're invariably dashed. And then we go back into this like behaving like jilted lovers, right? We're so betrayed by China suddenly.
Yeah, can I just offer like a slightly more optimistic take on this? Again, like I think, tariff created a lot of tension, and then this sudden reduction in tariffs sort of created more goodwill. And I think we need to be aware that we started with a very low trust environment between U.S. and China, and didn't start with Trump 2016. This is kind of we have been in this low trust environment for long. And my hope is this climb down would sort of open up that space of trust a little more. Again, like I think there's a real desire from both sides to rebalance. If you guys saw, Scott Bessent's talk in Middle East yesterday, he was actually referring directly to Ray Dalio's work of big and beautiful rebalancing. I think there's a real desire from both sides to rebalance. I think focusing on bilateral trade imbalance is the wrong way to go, but there is a real desire for the U.S. to reindustrialize. There's a real desire, from what I hear from Beijing, to actually pivot to domestic economy. The political will is very real. But how do we actually do that? I think the only way, or I don't see many alternatives other than just, permitting Chinese firms to invest in the U.S. either by, JVs or, share with some tech transfer built in. And speaking of spice and food, the Chinese side is happy with it. In their word, they want to bring our own food and eat at your table. In the sense that we can't just export our industrial capability to the U.S. If you want us, right? We can help you with your reindustrialization goal. And for the U.S., I mean, if you look at Trump's statement, this is very much about we have market access. So it's basically market for technology, but reversing the role of the United States and China. Now China is the one who offers technology and transfer it to the United States, and China is opening up its market for US firms to invest. If that works out, I think we might actually be at a starting point of something that's similar to a reset, but not in a sense of like U.S. and China are like locked in this long-term peer competitor. I just hate that framework, right?
I mean,
from your lips to God's ears.
Yeah, exactly. I love it. I love your optimism, but I mean, find me 5 people in Washington D.C. that have trust in China. And I mean, they're just and find me 5 people in Beijing around Xi Jinping that, I mean, listen, Xi has been, weaponizing the relationship with the U.S. I mean, this is a complete BS Chinese narrative out there that it's the U.S. that wants to decouple. We've seen Chinese decoupling
I don't
from
know.
the
That's
U.S.
complete BS.
for 10 years. I mean, listen, I mean, this is a mutual, both sides have deep, deep distrust. And I think this is back to Ronald Reagan and trust, but verify. And I think that I think it's going to take a long time for trust to be rebuilt now.
Well, look, I mean, it's not going to go back to business as usual, but I see the likelihood of American U.S. firms getting complacent, but I can pretty much promise you that no one who is running a firm in China with either export exposure or import vulnerabilities from the United States is going to get remotely complacent. They are once bitten and many times shy. Trust means letting your guard down a little bit. Nobody in China is going to let their guard down on this.
Well, I mean, just to be more constructive in my optimism, I think, sort of a potentially feasible next step is for both sides to have a clean, narrow, sort of white list of investment. What are the areas that we think are relatively low in terms of national security, priorities, and start from there. I think the current overreach in the name of national security, not just from China but from the United States, is creating a lot of unnecessary tension in the bilateral business relationship. And if both sides can publish a negative list clearly stating in which areas firms can and cannot invest, focusing on the can part and starting from the low priority stuff, I think that will be a really helpful first step.
Lizzie, do you think it's going to happen in Europe first? Do you think that these sorts of JVs with tech transfer built into them is going to be something we see the Germans doing before the U.S. takes it up?
I think that's exactly the right question. I think we will get more clarity maybe in the next 2 months or so, especially in July when European leaders visit China and Xi Jinping himself will be the one who receives them. And I think the really interesting piece is how China will offer in terms of addressing EU's concern on overcapacity. And my sense that overcapacity is probably the wrong word, but it is a reality. It's a real concern. Will China actually impose price floors for its exports? Will China actually consolidate domestic EV economy to let maybe 80% of its EV firms to go bankrupt? I think if China can manage to do that, that's a really concrete trust building point with EU, and I think there's real motivation there. It's gonna be painful for China, but I think there's actual sort of political momentum behind that to address some of EU's more substantial concern. Not just the problem is not we are overproducing. It's that you don't have the capability to compete with us. If China can really address
Andrew,
that.
let's bring you in here. What's your sense of this?
I was just gonna say. I mean, I also was gonna say I was laughing because I could hear Eric like holding himself back to let Lizzie finish her sentence before.
You want to hold him back a little longer.
Yeah.
Before we move.
But I also love the optimism. I'm also skeptical that the politics in DC will allow, at least on the U.S.-China piece you talked about, for that to move forward. I mean, the white list or the negative list is a great idea, but it kind of reminds me of course that would be a logical solution, but guess what? Economists don't run the world. If they did, then there would be logical outcomes like that, and instead politicians run the world. But I will say, to sort of support Lizzie's optimism, everything is on the table with Donald Trump. Right. I've always said, like, we could end up in a much better place for U.S.-China relations. Mm-hmm. Now, the national security hawks would hate it, but he is the one politician that can bring, recalcitrant Republicans along with him. That's right. And so if he says we want BYD and cattle to invest here, it could happen. And I'm skeptical, but I'm like, I don't want to discount the possibility.
No, Andrew, you're absolutely right. And just take a look at what's happened in the past week in the Mideast, where he is effectively broken with Netanyahu, and he's poised to make a breakthrough deal with Iran.
Right.
This is kind of one of the things that Trump can do. I mean, a year ago, if you asked me, would there be a break between Netanyahu and Trump, you would have said, no way. These guys are, there's no daylight between them at all. I mean, you saw the press conferences. Remember making Gaza the next Club Med kind of destination.
Right.
But so to Andrew's point, I think everything is on the table. But I want to get your guys' take on something. And I put a graphic up earlier on this question of the farmers. That's a very important constituency to Donald Trump. They're going to take a hit because one of the things that we're seeing is the Chinese are not messing around this time and moving their agricultural buys out of the U.S. Last week, there was a $900 million letter of intent signed with Argentina, huge increases in corn, beef, soybean buys in Brazil, and they are moving hard.
As we speak, right?
Yep. And they're moving quick and fast, and I don't think they're ever going to come back. This could potentially damage Trump politically if the farmers suffer long-term damage because of this, of what's going on. I'm just curious, what you guys think if he's vulnerable on the agricultural side.
Well, if I can jump in before we go to the U.S. side of it, I'll tie this to the question Kaiser asked earlier. Is this, a big kind of world historic moment that we're going to look back at? I think the tariff agreement, not necessarily. I think that's just a lot of volatility that people will see through. But what has fundamentally changed is China's playbook and its approach to these issues. China's, approaching this element or this chapter of the trade war, in my view, in such a more disciplined way than it did last time around. And that mindset and that capability, part of which is diversifying sources of imports and more import substitution, that's what's fundamentally changed. And I think, that China will never go back. I mean, it might temporarily buy more U.S. agriculture as part of a trade deal, but as soon as that runs its course, they are diversifying and never going back.
Yeah, I agree.
Eric, you raised what's happening in the Middle East with Trump's visit there. Besides the Qatar plane and all that stuff, which has made a lot of headlines, there's a lot of substance that's actually come out of this. But just to stay with China, how is the Geneva conference or the Geneva statement being received in the rest of the world, in your part of the world, in ASEAN or in?
Well, there's just huge relief. I mean, everybody wants to see this just go away. I mean, they really want to see some type of resolution and some type of stability come back into the global trading mechanism. And it's not there yet, but there is relief. Here in Southeast Asia, some of the countries have received some reprieves, like China, and these 90-day reprieves, and that's caused a lot of the anxiety to kind of subside, but people know that they're not out of the woods yet. Vietnam just started its negotiations this week. There was talk earlier, there were rumors last week that they had reached some kind of deal to bring the tariffs down to about the 20% range somehow. The Trump family's going to probably get a golf course out of this, a very expensive golf course that will put hundreds of millions of dollars into the family's pocket. That's going to be part of the deal. Starlink is coming into Vietnam. And so in Cambodia, starting their negotiations this week as well. The big question here in ASEAN countries is this question of, rules of origin and also transshipments. And so everybody's kind of keeping their eye, and they're making these public gestures to the Americans saying, we're not going to be a backdoor, for the Chinese around. Here's one of the interesting things. The State Department is going to be one of the divisions that would be tasked to monitor the content and to ensure that transshipments and rules of origin, are being adhered to. And they're cutting the State Department a lot. Right. And so there's a real open question as to how the United States is actually going to enforce the transshipment requirements that they're going to put on countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and others, where Chinese companies will probably be very aggressive to circumvent the higher tariffs that will be imposed on them and, back home in China.
Can I ask Eric a question on this one, Kaiser?
Yeah, go for it.
Or to the group. But I mean, it strikes me that even the current deal with China, but let's say there's even a better deal at some point, really kind of raises the stakes for the negotiations between these Southeast Asian countries and the US, because if Vietnam has a 25% tariff and China has 30, all of a sudden it's like these Chinese companies who've been operating in Vietnam are like, maybe it makes sense to go back home, right? Is there a feeling that the pressure might be on and they're worried about a deal between the US and China at all?
No, I think that they want stability. There's been, and also remember the outflow of Chinese manufacturing to the global South has been a process that's been underway for 4 or 5 years. It's accelerating now, in part because they want to diversify supply chains. They want to be closer to customers. They anticipated these tariff issues with the United States. Lots of drivers for it. Higher labor costs at home. I mean, we can go down the list of reasons why Chinese companies are moving abroad. So I don't think that there's going to be this reverse migration back home. The problem with China today is that the costs are considerably higher than they are in Cambodia and in Bangladesh and in Vietnam, even in Vietnam. Though Vietnam, by the way, has a labor shortage problem too. And so there's kind of almost full employment here. So they're going to run into some of those higher costs as well, but probably not. The thing that everybody wants is stability back in the marketplace. And that's we're still a long way away from that.
Yeah, can I also ask Eric a question, because this is super interesting to me. So, the one thing that I heard is this new momentum to regionalize this whole sort of within region integration push. The idea is, well, China has this problem, the United States not really a predictable partner. How do we actually build more structural flexibility in our trade system? Because a lot of the ASEAN countries still depend on the external sector. So the idea is, well, why can't we just leverage sort of within region comparative advantages, right? So Vietnam has infrastructure, Malaysia has consumer market, has tech, Cambodia has sort of relatively low cost labor. Well, within our region, there's comparative advantage. Why can't we just slash trade barriers between us? Can we just integrate more? So ASEAN as a whole has more stability against larger trading partners. Is that something real?
Yeah, that is something real. So if you build a car in Thailand, it crosses the border into Vietnam, virtually no tariff. And so we already have that in ASEAN, and that works surprisingly well. One other thing that should keep the White House folks up at night, I don't know if Peter Navarro is still around. Is he still around?
He's around.
Where is he? I mean, we're missing in action. We haven't
He's
seen
hanging out with Melania.
Okay, it's in Mar-a-Lago.
It could be worse. It could be with Ivanka.
One of the things, I mean, Peter Navarro, should be very concerned about was the ASEAN +3 statement that came out with China, South Korea, and Japan. And that is something that they're going to start working more closely together. It's every third Tuesday now. We have a high-level Japanese delegation somewhere in Southeast Asia. And this is one of the interesting points that I've been trying to warn my American friends about, is how fast the world is reconfiguring around the United States right now. You cannot believe the speed with which this is happening. And so I think, Lizzie, to your point, yes, this is happening. And by the way, a lot more emphasis on RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. That is going to be a mechanism that people are going to lean into. ASEAN trading, people are going to lean into. Much more talk about free trade agreements between individual ASEAN members and the rest of the world. Vietnam has pioneered this, by the way. Vietnam has got something like 9 FTAs, and they're going to lean into this. So they want to reduce their exposure into the U.S. market so they're not as vulnerable. Right now, 30% of Vietnamese exports go to the U.S. I've heard they'd like to bring that down to under 20. So that they're not as vulnerable to this and do more intra-regional trade, no doubt.
And something I tell policymakers in DC all the time who don't think about this stuff is that's not just happening at a political policy country level. Like, all of us here have been a part of or owned small businesses. If you're a small business or any business and your main customer becomes unreliable, you just by nature, by survival instincts, start thinking, okay, I'm going to reduce my exposure to that customer, because that customer, I can no longer rely on them as a firm. So companies in Southeast Asia and China, and even multinationals, because of this uncertainty, I think permanently are going to think we need to have at the very least, have a contingency plan in case this ever happens again. But to your point, Eric, I think these decisions are being made very quickly on the fly and are totally changing kind of the calculus of how commerce is done.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else we want to say about the trade agreement or the preliminary trade agreement or whatever? What are we calling it, by the way?
It's in fact, even Trump, and I was going to bring a soundbite, when he was doing an interview with Hannity on Air Force One on the way to Saudi Arabia, Hannity called it a trade deal. And Trump corrected him and said, it's the concept of a trade deal.
Oh, right. Was he just sort of riffing on these old, I have a concept of a plan?
Well, it's a concept, yeah, but it's not. I think it's a mistake to call this a deal.
No,
it is. I mean, Scott Bessent has called this a mechanism where there's a some type of structure in place for them to continue these negotiations. But I think it's premature to, yeah, calling it a deal, I think, is too early. And even Trump isn't calling it a deal.
No. I mean, and he's the man who knows all about deals. So shall we move on? We have another big topic that we want to get to today. Let's shift gears and talk about the other big story from the week's news. I know that, Eric, you're going to take center stage here a lot because you've been following this very closely and you've actually written about it. But there's this massive flare-up, as everyone knows, between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. We know India retaliated against alleged Pakistan-backed killings of tourists in Indian-controlled parts of Kashmir. And on May 7th, this culminated in a big aerial dogfight. That took place at quite a distance. Apparently, none of the aircraft actually crossed the border. What does all of this have to do? Well, as we apparently know, there were about 5 Indian jets that were downed by the PAF, by the Pakistani Air Force. And what does this have to do with China? Well, the Air Force, the planes they used were Chinese-made J-10C Vigorous Dragons. And they apparently downed as many as 5 that were, 2 or possibly 3 of them were these very advanced 4.5 generation Rafale fighters from France. These are among the very, very best European-made fighter jets. Eric, so you wrote about the reaction in China in a little piece that I actually published too, also on Sinica. You compared this, deep-seek moment as everyone is has been doing a lot this time in military hardware. So go. Okay. So indulge me for a few minutes here and allow me to prosecute my case here. So I wrote this column on Monday because I was looking at the Chinese media and looking at what you're seeing here on Reuters. And there was a lot of excitement on May 12th for the fact that there was these reports that the J-10Cs performed admirably well against, Indian Rafale fighters and whatnot. And so I have apparently angered the entire Indian subcontinent on LinkedIn. Seems easy to do, though.
They are absolutely furious with me. I am a propagandist. I'm paid by China. I'm paid by the CIA. Apparently, USAID has money again, and they're giving it to me to kind of spread this kind of misinformation. So let me just kind of walk you through what I saw, and I'd love to get your take. If you think I was right, if you think I was wrong, I can already hear my legions of Twitter and Indian followers on LinkedIn kind of just fuming with me. So let me just quickly, so you had that Reuters report. Let me just play a little soundbite here from the Pakistanis.
Last night, they had all 80 jets through which they attacked 6 bases of Pakistan, including 2 in Pakistan-administered Kashmir. These were attacked by Indian planes last night. The Pakistani side was completely ready. The moment the Indian side released payloads, we engaged their jets and shot down 5 Indian aircraft.
Pakistan says this is wreckage from one of the 5 Indian aircrafts it says it shot down. India has yet to comment on that claim.
Okay, so that's where this all kind of started on the Pakistani side. They had this video. They are the ones who said 5 jets were shot down. This then kind of goes forward and just sparks a fury of excitement in China, where they are just thrilled over what they're calling, their deep-seek or their deep-seek moment, where Chinese military tech, which had never been proven in battle before, demonstrated itself to be far more capable than a lot of people anticipated. And it kind of came as a surprise, which is kind of why, comparing it to their deep-seek. So you'll see, all over Chinese media, the same thing about the J-10 and the deep-seek moment and the performance of it. And there's just this national pride that came out. People are just, really excited. And then at the same time last week, if you were the proud owner of Avik Chengdu Aircraft Company stock. One you can see here, this thing just shot up. And if you look at the 5-day, it's been up 29%. And if you bought this thing last month, my God, you're up 50% in the market right now. So you can see kind of the euphoria that was going on in China. And so that was kind of the basis of what I was kind of going. And one other thing I want to share with you guys is this comment from one of India's, top national security commentators and writers. He's the editor of Force magazine. And I want to play you a short soundbite. And I think it's going to be really good for this group here to kind of dissect. And this will lead to where my column came from. So
17, they both are of Chinese origin. Next, the BVR missiles, beyond visual range missile. We've already heard about of PL-15 missile, which has come from China. Then satellites. The Beidou system of China, which has 44 satellites in its constellation, is today the number one satellite constellation in the world. And Pakistan military has access to its military resolutions, which means as far as Pakistan military is concerned, during Operation Sindoor, it had a complete visibility round the clock of the battle space. And it was also available to them for their missile targeting. Now, the next capability which they showcased was airborne early warning and control fighters. Now, again, these fighters, they are there for tracking a target, identification of the target. This is a capability, big capability, and they have 9 of them, the Pakistan Air Force. Next is electronic warfare, absolutely critical. And Pakistan Air Force, we saw in operation in 2019 Balakot air attacks that they have good electronic warfare. It does 2 things. One is it jams the communications of the enemy, and as part of electronic warfare, there is something called signal intelligence, which basically means that you can listen in to the communication of the enemy, which is what Aurangzeb, he showed a clip of the audio of the Indian pilots talking amongst themselves to the international audience that added to the credibility. And the next is the data linking. Pakistan Air Force data linking basically means you link up all these capabilities so that all these capabilities which are there, the satellites, the airborne assets, the ground assets, everybody can communicate with one another. Everybody knows what is going on in the battle space at any given time. Everybody knows who's doing what. That is data linking. And Pakistan has Link 17 data linking. It has had for many years now. Now it has upgraded. So these 6 capabilities that I spoke about, the most important in my assessment are data linking, and the second is electronic warfare.
Okay, so this is the point that I wanted to make. 81% of Pakistan's military hardware now comes from China. And the advantage that he laid out, and was what I made in the column, was the fact that because it's one ecosystem,
Right.
then Beidou can communicate with the JF-17, can communicate with the ground stations, can communicate with the airborne. And so India has a very different situation where they've got Russian equipment, Indian equipment, some US equipment, the Rafales are there from France. And that makes it very difficult to have this type of integration. So we're literally looking at a Apple versus Android, or Apple, where basically the hardware and the software are unified. And that's one of the points that the Chinese have been making. And I just thought that was interesting from an Indian perspective, not a Pakistani, a Western, a Chinese perspective. And so that was the case that I made, that this was the DeepSeek moment based on what the Chinese and even some Indian commentators were saying. So would love to kind of put it out to the group now.
No, that's fascinating, Eric. My initial question was, is it the J-10Cs or was it the PL-15s? What really mattered?
The PL-15s did not perform as well. I mean, according to Indian media, and again, one of the difficulties that we're having in all of this is the amount of misinformation. By the way,
there's the air-to-air missiles
and so we have just quantities of misinformation out there that make it really difficult. That's why, Cobus, I'm so used to Kaiser. That's why, even your intro saying 5 were shot down, 3 were shot down, we don't really know the definitive number. And everybody's going to dispute the number.
I mean,
you have to put a ton. Nobody really knows. And there's been no acknowledgement of it. But there is an assessment by a lot of Indian military analysts that the J-10Cs and the JF-17s, the Chinese tech, performed better than expected. And remember, India's defense budget is 11 times the size of Pakistan's. And it was apparently India that engaged J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio for the ceasefire talks. And so the question I kept putting back to the people yelling at me was, are you happy with how that played out? I mean, you have a defense budget 11 times larger than your rival, and yet this is what happened. So, that's where we are.
And Eric, can I just say, I think you're absolutely correct in your assessment. I mean, if you look at like J-10, right, it's not even China's most advanced fighter. I think what really made a difference here is that how it performed as part of a bigger system, paired with Chinese radar, early warning aircraft, long-range missiles, etc. So it's not a tech-to-tech comparison, but a system-to-system comparison. I think this is what really makes China's innovation model ticks. So in that sense, I mean, you see this in DeepSeek, in Huawei. It's about system integration. It's not about kind of cutting edge for the sake of being cutting edge. And I think that's a fundamentally different model of innovation. I think the world has yet to appreciate fully. And another part of it is cost effective, right? And that's also part of how China innovates. They're not like chasing, prestige tech or like, moonshots kind of innovations. It's more of a engineering mindset, what works, what can scale, how to get the most bang for the buck. You see this in DeepSeek, you see this in Huawei's Bessent chips, and now in defense too. So in some sense, China's innovation is not like breaking through the constraint. They're working around the constraint, and they can iterate really fast and can push really hard on commercialization and deployment. So not everything's cutting edge, but it's good enough, and they're integrated and they're affordable. I think that's a very different model of innovation when we think about what innovation means. And I think, Kaiser, you observe this on the ground, and I think, we need to pay more attention to this different mindset around innovation.
Absolutely. I think the Huawei comparison is even more apt maybe than the Apple, because Huawei really is just such an integrated technology ecosystem out there. It's full stack at this point.
But you would have heard, I mean, a lot of Pentagon people will tell you, and this is their top line reaction. Well, the Chinese, stole all of our IP. And it's well documented that the Chinese have pilfered a lot of American military IP. And one of the questions was, could they bring together this acquired, quote unquote, IP with their homegrown indigenous innovation to make it work? And they've had problems with some of their engines, and they've had problems with some of that integration. What we saw in Pakistan seems to indicate that those problems may have been ironed out in many respects. And the fusion of acquired IP with homegrown IP may have happened, at least at this level. So I think it defeats a little bit of some of the skepticism coming out of the Pentagon.
Well, and this is a point made in a different context, made in the semiconductor context, but I think is apt here, which is that China's absorption capacity has increased. What that basically means is it doesn't matter if you acquire IP if you can't really reverse engineer it to apply it into your systems. But China's capability to absorb foreign IP, foreign technology into its systems, which is what Lizzie is talking about, is now so advanced that whether they acquire IP or can kind of figure it out via, again, reverse engineering, it makes it much more difficult. It makes things like export controls and kind of trying to keep certain things from them much less effective, and shows that they can. It's all about the integration piece that we keep coming back to, which China is clearly getting better at.
Right. I just saw a little thing flash that said,
"Yeah, I'm getting our promos ready for the."
Okay,
Erica, what was the nature of the pushback online? Was there a substantive argument that people were making?
No, it's an emotion. It's that I'm a liar. And I don't know what I'm talking about, and I'm paid by the Chinese Communist Party to put this stuff out on LinkedIn.
That's all true, right?
Well, that has happened too. I mean, that's basically, a career, like occupational hazard when it comes to
it is an occupational hazard, but it is so interesting just to see how emotive the reaction is. That there is, there's, listen, the internet's not going to be a place where you get a lot of good, intellectual nuance, right? So,
No, indeed.
especially comment threads. But
Except
it was just a lot of anger of, you don't know what you're talking about. We basically could have wiped them off the map. And again, it was, as an American, we hear these kind of arguments a lot. So I'm kind of familiar with it, and there was a lot of these arguments of, well, if we wanted to, as a nuclear power, we could have wiped out Pakistan in 2 seconds. And I'm like, no, you really couldn't have, because they have a counterstrike capability. And so,
Eric, don't feed the trolls. Do not wade into this.
Well, don't feed the trolls. But again, this is a little bit of the arguments that the Americans had in Vietnam and in Afghanistan and in Iraq, that we could have, if we just used nuclear weapons, turned them all into glass. But we didn't do that But we didn't do that for very strategic reasons. India as well didn't do that.
Let's be fair here. I mean, the Chinese response to this, and you talked about stock prices of Chengdu Avik going up, but there was also a lot of very, very unkind trolling by Chinese who were gloating about this video, which has been making the rounds. And I think with insufficient criticism of it, with it's just straight up brown face, these Chinese guys, dressed like they're from Rajasthan with turbans and big mustaches, and doing, Bollywood dances and singing the song about, we bought a new plane, our plane is. Yeah, it's pretty awful too.
Gosh,
Chinese netizens.
Kaiser, I need your take on this. Like this level of just casual racism, even among some of China's most sophisticated commentators, is just I don't know what to make of it, and I don't see it getting better over the years.
It's casual racism. I mean, it's unfortunately it's pretty endemic. And, it's obviously not just China. It's everywhere. But I think Chinese have a particular blind spot with their racism toward people from the subcontinent.
Yeah.
It's coupled
really
with a growing sense of some rivalry. It's coupled with, sort of the geopolitical dynamics of, since the nuclear deal that Bush signed with India, there has been this sense that, India has been enlisted in the China containment project, with India's membership in the Quad and all this. So that's exacerbated it, and it's really brought it to the surface. But it's been there for a long time. It's always been, there's very unkind epithets that Chinese use frequently and very casually again in reference to Indian people. Mm-hmm. It doesn't help that there's just no direct flights right now. There's almost no presence there is literally no presence of Indian media in China right now, and very, very, very little Chinese coverage of India.
Well, just on that, they were just, before all this happened,
right?
We were on this positive upward momentum,
Absolutely.
Repairing ties after the Galwan incident a few years ago, where they were literally using sticks to fight each other in the Himalayas. There was we've got ambassadors back in each other's capitals. They're resuming student visas. Direct flights are planned to be resumed. So there was this upward momentum. So there was a lot of conspiracy theories in India that, China and Pakistan somehow conspired together to launch this, to provoke India into this attack. And my point was, no, what's in it for China to do that? They literally have they can gain so much more by trying to peel India away from the Quad and the U.S. security relationship. And we were seeing this. we were seeing a warming of relations. We saw troop pullbacks on the line of actual control, actual troop pullbacks. Meaningful, tangible things. So this is unfortunate for that, because when India and China are not getting along, it does create a lot of uncertainty, in Asia more broadly.
Right. All right, so I think we don't have too much more to say on this particular topic. I wanted to, since we are talking a little bit about, and got Eric here, tell us a little bit about Lula's visit in Brazil, in China.
Yeah, well, and not only that, we had a bunch of news this week where 3 Latin American leaders were in Beijing for the CELAC conference, and that's a ministerial gathering, but 3 heads of state went. So we had Boric from Chile, and we had Lula from Brazil, and Petro from Colombia. Colombia today signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative. So China lost one with Panama, but now gained another one with Colombia. That's got to be considered a huge win, a very big risk for Colombia. because they're going to piss off Marco Rubio and the Americans, and they're going to hear about this. So it's going to be pretty contentious for Colombia. You can already see the kind of conservative right-wing commercials that are going to be in Colombia's national elections next year are going to be like, we're going to get us out of the Belt and Road. And so China is now going to be an election issue in South America for a number of different governments. But $10 billion in export credits were announced by Xi at his speech to the CELAC gathering. Not a huge number, especially because Latin America and South America now are one of the most important trading regions for China. $515 billion of annual trade last year. That's a lot. And we're going to see it go up probably closer to 600 this year with all that agricultural buying. So
you always have these numbers to hand. You always know the trade volume.
Oh, because you just sit here obsessively in this room and banging out stories on it day in and day out. It just gets burned into your brain.
I mean, I have to make flashcards to remember the Politburo Standing Committee members.
I can't even remember that.
You're amazing. So to wrap things up, I've got this little segment that I do at the end of Sinica, as you all know, about recommendations, but they're usually really off the wall. They can be, anything at all. But what I want to do with this show is let's do plugs of China-specific media that we've come across, articles or interviews, podcasts, and anything at all that's really caught your attention and anything ought to be something that our audience ought to check out. And I can start. And I'm going to say the Odd Lots podcast with Arthur Krober, which was just amazing. If you haven't heard that, it was just from last week. It was just beautiful. I mean, the guy is, well, he nailed it. First of all, he got everything completely right. This was before the weekend meeting, but he had a very, very, very smart take on this. I think it's one of the smarter things I'm really curious, especially about Lizzie and Andrew's responses to his understanding of the narrative of the need to rebalance and whether the urgent need to rebalance toward consumption is a largely foreign economist talking point, or whether that is something that China and Chinese economists also repeat. That's something possibly controversial.
Kaiser, I think you're absolutely right. That's also the piece of the interview that caught my attention. And I think we probably need a whole episode devoted into this. But I think, he's absolutely right when it comes to sort of this, so in the West, when we think of consumption, well, it's it's an argument in the utility function, right? U is a function of C. So
right.
Basically, in the Keynesian model, you trade off wage is earned by labor, and your source of happiness, your source of utility is consumption. Right. In China, I think when we think about sort of what the constructs of happiness or a construct of well-being, it's much larger than consumption. And what are the policy goals? What are the targets? What are the arguments into the utility function when policymakers are thinking about this pivot to the domestic? I think it goes beyond consumption. I think it's structural.
Right.
It's the Western economists would interpret it as supply side, but for the Chinese policymakers, it's actually sort of the infrastructure of consumption that matters. You invest
good subways to ride and high-speed rail trains to get around on, and the seamless convenience of transportation in Chinese cities, right?
Right. So that makes me think maybe a better term to capture this pivot is pivot to higher quality of life, not necessarily pivoting to consumption as a proxy for higher quality of life. Again, like that
is a supply side solution, and that's been an interesting one. That's basically when China talks about consumer upgrade, when they talk about that's all included in it. So yeah, I think he nailed that. Andrew, what were your thoughts?
Well, I mean, to be fair,
yeah, sure.
No, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Lizzie.
No, yeah. So I think we need a new vocabulary. I mean, the Chinese side need a new vocabulary to capture what it really wants. It's not infrastructure. It's not investment. It's not supply. Like, what do you actually call it? I mean, the new buzzword in town.
Quality of life.
From investing in infrastructure to investing in people. So we're still doing investing, but the object the objective of our investment is people. That's not a plus vocabulary if you ask me. But I think the Chinese side need to be much more articulate about what it's actually targeting when it's pivoting to domestic. Again, as I said,
coin something right now and make it.
This is your moment, Lizzie.
No, I like quality of life.
Investing in quality of life, I think, is what I think of it as. All right.
Sounds better in Chinese, right?
Yeah.
I actually haven't listened to the Odd Lots podcast. I will do, so I'm not 100% familiar with Arthur's most recent argument, but I think
just cut out here for a second. So.
Oh, that's all good. You got me. Okay. I was just saying I haven't listened to the Odd Lots podcast, so I'm not 100% sure about Arthur's argument. But actually, I really like the way Lizzie framed it, because the way I frame it is that similarly, I like the infrastructure of consumption. Chinese leaders, in my view, see consumption actually as the end of a process, not as the beginning. Right. And so Western economists look and say, you need, according to the national income accounting, C as C as consumption, household consumption versus net imports, government spending, investment. We need that C to grow because that's a more sustainable way to grow your economy. Our view would be that actually Beijing's ideal plan would, again, start with sort of the supply side that Lizzie talked about. They want a more productive economy, more productive and innovative companies that make more profit, that can then raise wages for their employees, pay more in taxes. And then at the end of that process, the employees have more money in their pocket. The state has more money in its pocket to then build out a welfare system or a public welfare support that then allows people to save less, and then they can spend more at the end of that because of all those things that have happened. And so our view is that they would like more consumption, but kind of through a process that really focuses on innovation and selling, more, cutting edge technological goods, both domestically and to the rest of the world. So my view is like they want consumption, but they want it to be sustainable, and to make it sustainable, all those other things have to happen first. So ultimately, they're not going to pivot in the short term. But
I'm very glad my little plug sparked such an interesting conversation about the whole philosophy of the Chinese economy. But let's move around, and let's start with Eric. And what do you have for a good plug for this week?
Okay, so I feel like, Kaiser, I have to repair my reputation with you, because the last time I was on Sinica, I recommended The Boiling Moat by Matt Pottinger, and I could hear the gasp from you. But it was interesting, nonetheless. Okay, so I'm gonna suck up to Lizzie now, because I'm about 60% through her boss's book on Xi Jinping, and it's not an easy read. It's like reading his PhD dissertation, but it's an important read. He gets into the minutia of, and I think it's an important read right now to understand kind of the history of where he's coming from, how he sees the world, how he's been restructuring both the ideological and the policy base for this moment that we're in today. It's very interesting. It's heavy. It's not for the amateur, to be sure. Lizzie, have you read it? I mean, is it required reading at the office that Kevin makes everybody do it? You got to get through all 900 pages of it.
Yeah, we study Xi Jinping 思想.
That's right.
No, that's a joke.
Every Thursday at 10:30 of your study sessions with this,
Yeah, and we write report on how our ideology is purified after reading the book. How we are more productive just by having it in our hand all the time. No, that's a joke. That's a joke.
You have an app, right? You have a little red app.
And we sort of check in every day to click on the badge and stuff. It's like Duolingo.
And just for those at home who may not get the inside joke, Kevin Rudd, who is the author of this book, is Ambassador Kevin Rudd is the former president of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and now the ambassador to Washington, but spent a lot of time in Beijing. And he is very determined in the audiobook to make sure that you know that he speaks fluent Mandarin.
Yeah.
Because throughout the audiobook, there's a whole lot of him speaking Chinese, so which is good, it's an excellent, it's a good read. It's a very good read. And I think that paired with Richard McGregor's The Party is really, those are two good books that go together very, very well. Last rather very quick thing, this week's interview on The Daily with Keith Bradshaw from the New York Times, excellent as well.
I had some quibbles, but it was largely good. I had quibbles. We can talk about that another time. But yeah. All right, let's go to Lizzie. What's your plug for the week?
Well, I mean, first, I think Eric, you're absolutely right. I think Kevin is one of the most deep thinkers, especially when it comes to party language. And I think, it's incredibly important for us to understand how the party not just talks to the world, but also talks to itself.
You've written about this.
Yeah, and I would argue that, even more important than understanding Xi Jinping's language is to understand his top bureaucrats' language and their thinking. Sort of along those lines, I mean, I just love it when we unearth old gems from Chinese internet, which is quickly narrowing and disappearing. Well, I just realized that one of the top 3 Chinese officials at the Geneva talks, Liao Min, is the same Liao Min who was something of a folk music celebrity back in the 90s, and he actually wrote a song called "Waiting for Someone is like drinking alcohol." 等人就像在喝酒. So I have no idea whether when our audience can find the original soundtrack of it. But what I find really interesting is this is from an old interview with Liao Min when he's not as prominent as an official. He was talking about his days as a student in PKU, right, Beida. So he was like, "Oh, we were so idealistic back then. The campus was not nearly as commercial or frantic as it now. We don't feel the pressure of landing a job as students do these days. We were so single-minded in our pursuit of classical liberal learning. Each day we moved between our classroom, the gym, the library, and dorms. Just those 4 places. We never want to leave the campus. We basically just walked in straight lines without even turning corners." I just find that fascinating.
Nice. That does sound like campus idealism. And he was sort of the 校园民谣 kind of guy, right?
Right.
Like campus folk rock.
Kaiser, that's this on you to find us the soundtrack.
Yeah, no, I'll find that. But also, I'm feeling a little, rivalrous here. I thought I had a lock on like former, rock musician turned political commentator type, but that's great.
It'll keep you sharp. Keep you sharp to have some competition.
Great recommendation. And Andrew, what's your plug for the week?
Yeah, if I can, it's not totally selfish, but I'm going to plug a piece that one of my business partners and colleagues wrote recently, Kendra Schaefer, who
the algorithm.
Yeah. So this is on our website, triviumchina.com, under the research tab. But she basically wrote a piece that, the Cyber Security Administration of China basically has a registration system for any AI product that goes onto the market. And so she pulled that and did some analysis on it. So some really fascinating preliminary findings, just to run through a couple. There's almost 4,000 registered generative AI or algorithmic tools operating in China. They're approving 250 to 300 a month. So you can kind of see how quickly the space is growing. They're mostly focused on B2B and kind of foundational technologies, not more the niche stuff. But the thing that I found, one of the things that I love about the piece is it just highlights there are these data sets out there that the state in China maintains that you can mine for all kinds of interesting information on what's going on, and it's fully publicly available. And I thought this was a really great example of that. So I encourage people to check it out.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's astonishing. And I'm reading it again ahead of an interview with Kendra, because I'm going to put her on Sinica and we're going to talk all about this. Kendra, by the way, is just brilliant. I had a chance to see her recently in Pittsburgh when I was in town. and she took me to a cool little hip coffee shop, and we chatted China for a good hour and a half. All right. Well, that's a wrap. You guys, thank you. This was our maiden voyage. We didn't dare go live with it, but I think this is going to work. Yeah? What do you think?
I think we will. It'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
All right.
right.
And we will see you again in a couple of weeks, right? And Eric, you're still going to be out in Southeast Asia. You two are both going to be in DC. Or Lizzie, you're going to be in New York. Andrew, you're going to be in DC. I'm going to be, I will not have left for Beijing yet. So, but the week after that, I'll be doing that one from Beijing. All right, folks. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time. Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Appreciate it. Bye, guys.